My name is Haruto, and what I'm about to share happened about a year ago when I was still a university student in a quiet mountain town in Japan. My life then was ordinary. Classes by day, studying late into the night, and when the stress became too much, long walks to clear my head. Those walks were my escape, a way to feel the world stretch beyond the walls of my tiny apartment. One night, after an especially grueling study session, I decided to take a shortcut home. It was late, the streets were deserted, and the shortcut involved a tunnel, a long abandoned one that cut through the mountain. Locals avoided it, whispering stories of tragic accidents and deaths that defied explanation. I'd always dismissed such tales as superstitions, old folklore meant to keep children out of dangerous places. I wasn't a child, and I was tired. The moment I stepped into the tunnel, the air changed. It was like walking into a vacuum, cold and damp, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. Weak, flickering bulbs lined the ceiling, casting erratic pale light over the moss-slick walls. Water dripped somewhere, an irregular plink that echoed unnervingly, almost like footsteps trailing behind me. I paused to listen, but the only sound was my own breathing, unsteady, louder than it should have been. Halfway through, I heard it, a whisper, faint, distant, almost too soft to be real. I stopped again, straining to hear, but there was only silence, heavy and suffocating. Then came the feeling, a prickling awareness that crawled up my spine. Someone was behind me. My chest tightened as I turned sharply, expecting to see... What? The empty tunnel yawned back at me, darkness pressing at the edges of the dim light. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves. Still, my legs moved faster, each step echoing louder as I rushed toward the faint outline of the tunnel's exit. The air seemed to thicken, the darkness behind me almost palpable, as though it was following, reaching for me. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might drown out everything else. When I finally emerged into the crisp night air, it felt like breaking the surface after nearly drowning. I filled my lungs with the cold, clean breeze, letting the distant glow of the city lights anchor me. At home, I tossed my jacket over a chair, desperate for a hot shower to wash away the tension clinging to my skin. But as I passed by the jacket, I froze. There were handprints on the back, thin, skeletal prints smeared with what looked like black grime or soot, the fingers unnaturally long. My mind raced. Had I brushed against something in the tunnel? No, I would have noticed. These weren't smudges. They were deliberate, as if someone had grabbed me. My stomach churned. I grabbed the jacket and shoved it into the washing machine, scrubbing at the fabric with trembling hands, as if cleaning it would erase the memory, erase the way those marks felt wrong, invasive. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every shadow in the room suddenly alive, every creak of the building too loud. Sleep wouldn't come, only the sensation of phantom fingers pressing against my back. In the days that followed, things didn't return to normal. I started avoiding dark places entirely, mapping my life around sunlight and bright, crowded spaces. Even then, the cold feeling would creep in when I was alone, like an invisible weight settling over me. My friends noticed. I could see it in their sidelong glances, hear it in their half-joking comments about my nerves. But how could I explain it? How could I tell them about the whispers, the handprints, the suffocating darkness that still felt too close? How could I explain it when I didn't understand it myself? One night, As I sat hunched over my desk with a pile of notes and textbooks, a sudden chill swept through the room. It was so sharp and unnatural that I dropped the book I was holding. When I bent to pick it up, my eyes caught something on the wall beside my bed. Something that shouldn't have been there. Dirty handprints, the same as the ones on my jacket, smeared across the pale surface. They were long, uneven, and dark, as though they had been pressed there with purpose. My breath caught, and my chest tightened. I froze, staring, every nerve in my body screaming to move but unable to obey. When I finally tore my gaze away, panic set in. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat in the living room with the lights on all night, unable to go back in. Whatever this was, it wasn't my imagination. It wasn't just fear. It was real. I needed help, and I needed it now. The next morning, with sleep-deprived determination, I remembered an old temple on the hilltop. Locals spoke of the monk who lived there, a man said to possess a deep connection with the spiritual world. Climbing the worn stone steps, I felt every step grow heavier, as if I carried the weight of those invisible hands on my shoulders. The temple was serene, an almost jarring contrast to the chaos in my mind. Wind chimes tinkled softly, and the air smelled of burning incense. When the monk appeared, his eyes met mine with an understanding that made my chest tighten again. He knew why I was there. I told him everything. The tunnel, the handprints, the chills that clung to me like shadows. He listened in silence, his expression calm but unreadable. When I finished, he nodded and spoke in a voice as steady as the earth beneath us. The tunnel, he said, was a place stained with restless spirits, wandering souls tethered by violence or grief. Some might linger, attaching themselves to those who crossed their path. He offered to perform a purification ceremony to sever the connection. Without hesitation, I agreed. The ceremony began in a quiet chamber, lit by dim lanterns. The monk chanted in a low rhythmic tone, each syllable vibrating through the air and into my chest. He circled me, ringing a bell that sent sharp, piercing tones into the silence. The sound seemed to cut through something unseen, and the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. Salt and rice were sprinkled on the ground in precise patterns, and the faint aroma of burning herbs filled the space. At one point, he brushed me with a sakaki branch dipped in water, and I flinched. It felt cold, but not like water. It was deeper, as though it touched a part of me I didn't understand. Then it happened. A light pressure on my shoulders, distinct and deliberate, like a pair of hands resting there. My breath hitched, but I didn't move. Unlike before, the sensation wasn't hostile. It lingered for a moment before fading, leaving behind a strange warmth that spread through my chest. The monk's chanting slowed, and when he opened his eyes, he gave me a faint smile. The spirit, he said, had been guided to rest. The connection was broken. Relief hit me in a rush, and I thanked him with a gratitude I couldn't put into words. As I descended the steps, everything felt sharper, clearer. The rustling leaves, the distant chirping of birds, even the faint hum of the city below. It all felt alive again, as if the world had opened back up to me. In the days that followed, the weight I'd carried for weeks was gone. The chills that once haunted me were replaced by warmth. I could walk into dark rooms without hesitation, my steps steady, my mind calm. When I told my closest friends, I expected disbelief, but they listened. Some things are beyond us, one said, and I realized how true that was. I've never gone back to the tunnel. It's not fear that keeps me away, but respect. Respect for the warnings etched into local lore, for the spirits that might still linger, and for the unknown forces that shape our world in ways we can't always see. Some things are better left undisturbed, and that's a lesson I'll carry with me always. I'm a 23-year-old woman, born and raised in Tokyo, but every summer of my childhood was spent at my grandmother's house in a small rural village in Japan. Her house, an ancient wooden structure, always felt like stepping into another era. The paper walls creaked in the wind, and the low hum of cicadas seemed to blend with murmurs I couldn't place. Even as a child, I felt there were secrets here, things left unsaid. Recently, I decided to visit again to help my aging grandmother maintain the property. She often mentioned that the house needed care, but there was an urgency in her voice this time, as if something was slipping away. For the first few days, everything was as I remembered. I swept the garden, cleared away debris, and listened to the gentle rhythm of the countryside. But on the third day, as I worked near the back of the house, I noticed something unusual, a patch of grass growing thicker and darker than the rest. When I stepped closer, I found a pile of rotting wooden planks, warped and half swallowed by the earth. Beneath the mossy boards, something glinted faintly in the sunlight. Curiosity tugged at me, though I couldn't explain why. The air here felt wrong, heavy, almost expectant. I crouched down and peered between the boards, finding a small moss-covered well, its rim barely visible beneath years of neglect. My pulse quickened, but I dismissed the feeling. It was just an old well, abandoned like so many things in the countryside. And yet I couldn't shake the sensation that I was trespassing, not just on land, but on something deeper. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay in bed, the window open to let in the cool night air, the steady drone of crickets lulling me into a half-sleep. And then I heard it, a voice. At first, I thought it was the wind. But no, this was different. A faint, dragging whisper, as though someone were calling from a distance. My chest tightened, and I held my breath, listening. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Unable to ignore it, I got up and went to the window. Outside, the world was still, bathed in silver moonlight, but the whisper didn't stop. It pulled at me, low and insistent, urging me toward the back of the house. By the time I reached the well, my hands were trembling. The planks seemed to shift under my weight as I knelt beside them. The whisper louder now, a wordless plea seeping into my thoughts. Then I saw them, fragments of objects tangled in the rotting wood. A child's shoe, its leather cracked and discolored, a bracelet, the tiny beads dulled with age. I recoiled, a cold knot forming in my stomach. These items didn't belong here. They shouldn't be here. My grandmother's words came rushing back. Stay away from the well. She'd said it countless times when I was little, her voice tight with something I couldn't name back then. Now, standing in the oppressive silence, I understood. The next morning, I confronted her. She sat at the breakfast table, her hands folded tightly, her eyes avoiding mine. When I mentioned the well, her spoon clattered against the bowl, and she stiffened as if bracing for a blow. "Don't go near it," she said sharply, her voice trembling. "Why not?" I demanded, though part of me already knew I wouldn't like the answer. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, in a voice thick with pain, she began to speak. She told me about the disappearances, stories whispered among villagers, but never spoken aloud. Children who vanished without a trace, families who left abruptly, their houses standing empty for years. And through it all, the well had been there, a silent witness to the inexplicable. "It's cursed," she said finally. "Our family's burden." Her words lingered with me all day, but they didn't quench my curiosity. That afternoon, I returned to the well, the sky a bruised shade of orange as the sun dipped behind the trees. I was determined to see for myself, no matter what it cost. I pulled away the planks, the damp wood crumbling under my hands. A foul, earthy smell hit me, and I gagged. As I leaned closer, something pale caught my eye. My breath hitched. A hand. It was small and lifeless, the skin waxy and stretched taut, its fingers half curled as if reaching for something or someone. My body froze. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The hand, small and lifeless, lay in the damp earth, its skin stretched taut over bones, discolored and decaying. It had been there for years, decades maybe. But it wasn't just the hand that terrified me. Scattered around it were other objects. A faded photograph of a child, the face smeared with dirt and time, and a silver bracelet that caught the light like a silent plea. My stomach churned, but I couldn't move. My hands trembled as I reached for the planks, desperate to uncover more, but they wouldn't budge. Then I whispered, barely audible, "What happened here?" The moment the words left my lips, the weight of being watched consumed me. My skin prickled, and the air around me felt alive, charged with a presence I couldn't see but could feel, pressing in from all sides. Something, someone, was behind me, watching, waiting. I stumbled back, my breath shallow and uneven, and ran to the house. When I told my grandmother what I'd found, she didn't speak right away. Her face drained of color, her usual calm replaced with something I hadn't seen before. Fear. She sat silently, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if looking through it, her hands trembling in her lap. When she finally spoke, it was in a voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear her. "I always knew this day would come," she said. She asked me to help her to the phone, where she made a call to an old family friend, a retired police officer who still lived in the village. Her hands shook as she dialed, her face a mask of regret. When the officer arrived the next day, he brought 2 others with him. They spoke in hushed tones before heading to the well. By late afternoon, the truth we'd all been dreading came to light. Human remains were recovered from the well, tangled with the personal items I'd seen: a child's shoe, scraps of fabric, other fragments of lives long gone. The officers confirmed what no one wanted to believe. These remains had been there for decades, a grim echo of the disappearances that haunted the village's past. My grandmother stood silently as they worked, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She whispered to me, "I hoped it would never come to this." Her voice broke as she continued, "But maybe it's better this way. Maybe it's time the truth came out." That evening, the house felt impossibly still. The relief of finally uncovering the mystery wasn't enough to erase the shadows it had cast. The well, even emptied of its terrible contents, still felt alive. Its presence loomed at the back of the house, its silence heavier than ever. I tried to move on, but every time I stepped outside, the feeling of being watched consumed me. It was as if the well had eyes, as if its story wasn't finished. My grandmother seemed lighter, almost as if a weight had lifted from her. But her gaze often drifted toward the horizon at sunset, her expression clouded with fear. She knew more than she was willing to say. Weeks later, when I returned to Tokyo, I told myself it was over. But deep down, I knew better. Late at night, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I would hear them again, those voices. Faint, dragging whispers, like they were reaching across the distance, still calling for help. Last time I visited the village, the well had been sealed. New planks, clean and sturdy, covered its opening. But that didn't stop the shiver that ran through me when I stood near it. When I reached out to touch the wood, a chill spread through my hand, as if the well itself remembered. I never went back. Even now, I can feel its presence, a shadow that follows me no matter where I go. Some nights, when the world is quiet, I hear the voices again, their cries faint but insistent. I know I'll never understand everything that happened there, and part of me thinks that's for the best, because some things should stay buried. My name is Emmy, and I was 16 back then, a quiet high schooler in Nagoya, living with my parents in a small, modest apartment. Life was steady, predictable. I wasn't popular, but I wasn't an outcast either. I mostly kept my head down, focusing on schoolwork and spending quiet weekends with my family. Nothing in my life prepared me for what happened with Aiko. She was a classmate, though not someone I knew well. Aiko was odd, always had been. She missed school often, but no one seemed to care. If her name came up in the hallways, it was fleeting, almost like a rumor. Then one day, she was gone for 3 weeks, and for some reason, her absence stuck with me. I couldn't explain why. It just felt different. One morning in autumn, as I walked back from the bathroom, I saw her. She was at the bottom of the stairwell, tucked into a shadowed corner where the light didn't quite reach. Something about her stopped me cold. Her skin, normally pale, looked almost gray. She was perfectly still. Her shoulders slumped like a puppet with its strings cut. When her eyes flicked toward me, she quickly looked away, avoiding my gaze entirely. I called her name. Aiko? My voice sounded too loud in the empty hallway. She didn't respond, just turned and walked away, her steps unnaturally stiff. Then she was gone, disappearing into one of the unused back rooms. That moment clung to me. It wasn't her usual strangeness. This was something else, something darker. I tried to brush it off, but it nagged at me. And then, Aiko never came back to school. Days passed. I asked a teacher about her, but they only said she was dealing with personal problems. It felt rehearsed, dismissive, as if they didn't care enough to elaborate. My unease grew heavier. The next time I saw her, it was in a place I wasn't expecting, an alley on my way home from school. The sun was dipping below the rooftops, casting everything in muted orange and shadow. Aiko was leaning against a wall, her head bowed, her frame trembling like she was barely holding herself together. My steps faltered, but I forced myself closer. Aiko? I said hesitantly. She didn't look up at first. When she finally did, her face was pale, almost lifeless, and her eyes were red, swollen from crying. Emmy? Her voice wavered, barely audible. I don't know what to do. She looked so fragile, like she might shatter if I touched her. I crouched beside her, unsure of what to say, but before I could speak, she whispered words that turned my stomach. There's this uncle, a friend of my mom's. He keeps coming over, Emmy. He stares at me. He makes me be alone with him. He says it's a secret. Her voice broke, her shoulders shaking as though she might crumble under the weight of it all. I can't take it anymore. I didn't know what to say. My chest tightened, my throat dry, as if I'd swallowed dust. She wasn't confused. There was no mistaking the fear in her voice, the haunted look in her eyes. I nodded, muttering something about helping her, though I wasn't sure how. I convinced her to come to school with me the next day, so we could talk to a teacher. But doubt gnawed at me. What if I was wrong? What if this wasn't what it seemed? Still, I couldn't leave her alone. The next morning, I told our history teacher, a man who always seemed kind and approachable, what Aiko had shared with me. I expected him to be alarmed, to take action, to do something. Instead, he just sighed, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. Oh, it's probably just a misunderstanding. Family stuff, you know, he said casually, as if this were normal. His indifference left me cold. I glanced at Aiko, sitting quietly with her head down, and I could see it in her face. She already knew he wouldn't help. I felt powerless, a lump rising in my throat. The room felt too bright, the air too still, as if the world itself was indifferent. Aiko was alone. And now, so was I. After that day, everything unraveled. Aiko stopped coming to school entirely, and the so-called uncle began visiting her house more frequently. I felt it in my gut. Something was horribly wrong. But what could I do? I had no proof, no authority, and everyone around me acted like I was being dramatic. Even the teacher I had trusted seemed indifferent. I was just a kid. I couldn't force anyone to listen. It was a week later when it happened. I was sitting at my desk, trying to distract myself with homework, when the first scream tore through the stillness. It wasn't just a cry. It was raw, guttural, the kind of sound that pulls the air from your lungs. My hands froze, pencil clattering to the floor. For a moment, I didn't move. But then another scream came, and I bolted to the window. Outside, the street was alive with motion. Neighbors were spilling out of their houses, some rushing toward Aiko's building, others fumbling with phones to call the police. My heart pounded as I stared up at her window, and I knew, deep down, I knew what was happening. The screaming continued, broken by muffled cries of pain and something else, something deeper, almost inhuman, that made my skin crawl. I couldn't breathe. My legs shook so badly I had to grip the windowsill just to stay upright. Then, like the snap of a string, everything went quiet. Minutes later, the police arrived. The flashing lights bathed the street in red and blue, surreal and cold. I watched as they dragged him out, a man I'd only ever seen in passing, but now knew too well. Aiko's uncle. He kept his head down, but his hands were cuffed, and his face was devoid of any emotion. Neighbors whispered to each other in hushed tones, but their words were drowned out by the pounding of my heart. Later, I learned the truth, or at least part of it. He'd been forcing Aiko into isolation, pressuring her, threatening her. The investigation revealed a string of similar accusations, buried and ignored over the years. I should have felt relieved when he was taken away, but all I could think about was Aiko, what she had endured, how long she'd suffered in silence. She didn't leave the house that night, not even to speak to the police. Neighbors who saw her later said she was hollow, her face drained of everything but the weight of what had happened. Her family moved within days, as if packing up their lives would erase the horrors that had taken root in that apartment. But it didn't matter. Aiko wasn't the same. She withdrew into herself completely, a shadow of the person she had been. No one saw her smile again. No one heard her laugh. It was as if the world had stopped for her, leaving only the echoes of her pain. And I couldn't shake the guilt. It gnawed at me, relentless and sharp. I replayed every moment I'd spent with Aiko, every conversation, every chance I'd had to push harder, to make someone listen. I kept thinking, what if I'd done more? But deep down, I knew the truth. I'd tried. I'd done what I could. It wasn't enough, but it was all I had. The real failure wasn't mine. It belonged to the system, to the adults who ignored her, to the world that turned its back on her cries for help. Time passed. I never saw Aiko again after she moved, and I don't know if she ever found peace. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about her, wondering if she managed to heal, or if the shadows of that time still follow her. The helplessness lingers, a constant ache I've learned to live with. But what terrifies me most is knowing how common her story is. Aiko wasn't just a girl in my class. She could be anyone. This kind of thing happens everywhere, in any city, on any street. And it so often goes unnoticed, dismissed, until it's too late. I don't know why I'm writing this now, but maybe it's because I need to believe that telling her story means something, that it might stop someone else from turning away. If you ever see the signs, if someone confides in you, if someone like Aiko crosses your path, please, don't ignore it. Don't dismiss it, because silence is the loudest weapon. And if we choose to look the other way, we become complicit. Aiko's fear still echoes in my mind, sharp and endless. I hope it reaches you too. I never thought something like this could happen to me. Life in my little apartment on the outskirts of Tokyo had always been unremarkable, a comfortable kind of quiet. I worked long shifts as a barista in Shibuya, saved what I could for a trip I'd been dreaming about, and occasionally met friends for dinner. My days had a rhythm I didn't think twice about, until the day I came home and found the first box. It was waiting by the entrance to my building, small and neatly wrapped in paper, so crisp it seemed almost ceremonial. A handwritten note stuck to the top read, "For someone special." For a moment, I thought it was a neighbor's package, but no name, no address, just that cryptic note. My chest tightened as I glanced around, but the street was quiet, the shadows lengthening in the late afternoon light. I carried it upstairs, unsure if I was being careful or foolish. Inside were a few sweets and a porcelain figurine. Its vintage glaze cracked, the face half worn like something forgotten on a dusty shelf. It was strange, but harmless enough. I told myself it had to be a prank, maybe a mix-up. Still, as I set it aside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The boxes kept coming, Every day when I got home, there was another one waiting. Small, neat, and always unsettling. A charm from a street market one day, a polished piece of jade the next. The notes were polite, but there was something about their words. Phrases like, "May your luck never run out," that felt too intimate, too deliberate. I laughed it off with my friends at first, brushing it aside like it didn't bother me. But late at night, I couldn't stop thinking about them. Who was leaving these? And why me? Then came the lock of hair. It was tangled and black, the strands coarse, still clinging to bits of root. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't a joke anymore. My hands were trembling as I dropped the box, the hair spilling onto my kitchen counter like something alive. My apartment suddenly felt smaller, darker. I locked every window and door that night, but it didn't matter. The thought that someone knew where I lived was enough to keep me awake until sunrise. I went to the police the next day, clutching the box like it was evidence in a trial. I explained everything, the sweets, the charms, the hair, but they only nodded, polite and detached. "We'll investigate," they said. I left feeling more exposed than ever. The boxes didn't stop. Every night, I paced my apartment, my ears tuned to every creak of the floorboards or whisper of wind against the window. My chest was tight with a feeling I couldn't name, something between dread and inevitability. Finally, I installed cameras in the hallway, small discreet ones I hoped no one would notice. I had to know who was doing this. It didn't take long. A few days later, I caught him. The footage was grainy but unmistakable. A man, average build, unassuming. My stomach dropped as I recognized him. A regular at the cafe. He always ordered the same thing, always sat in the corner. He never spoke much beyond pleasantries, but his eyes had lingered on me once or twice, enough for me to notice. On the camera, he moved slowly, deliberately, placing the box by the door and standing there for a moment, just standing, watching. I felt cold all over, like I'd been submerged in ice water. My breathing hitched as I stared at his face on the screen. He looked so ordinary, bland even, the kind of man you'd never look at twice in a crowd. But now, he was the only thing I could see. That was the moment it all became real. Someone was watching me, and he wasn't going to stop. I froze as I watched the footage. Night after night, he appeared like clockwork, slipping into the building with a strange, knowing smile. There was something theatrical in the way he moved, deliberate yet unhurried, as if he was part of some twisted play I hadn't been invited to. On the screen, I watched him carefully set the boxes at my door, his gaze darting around just enough to check his surroundings, but never betraying a hint of fear. It was as if he already knew I wouldn't catch him, like he knew exactly where I'd be at every moment. When I took the recordings to the police, I felt hollow, my words mechanical as I explained everything. The fear and helplessness were so heavy I could barely breathe, but it still felt like he was a step ahead, orchestrating something I couldn't comprehend. The officers moved quickly after I handed over the footage. That night, they caught him red-handed. I watched from my window as the police cars swarmed the street, their lights painting the walls of my apartment in a cold, rhythmic glow. He didn't resist. The man who had haunted me for weeks went quietly, his hands slipping behind his back to meet the cuffs as though he'd been waiting for this moment. From my vantage point, I could see his face clearly. He wasn't scared or angry. He looked relieved, like the weight of whatever this was had finally been lifted from his shoulders. That expression clung to me long after the police cars disappeared into the night. I should have felt safe. Instead, my unease only deepened. Even after he was behind bars, it felt like his presence lingered. The air in my apartment felt heavier, the shadows longer. Every creak of the floorboards at night made my chest tighten, and sleep became an elusive, distant memory. I told myself it was over, but the truth was harder to admit. He'd taken something from me, something I couldn't get back. I couldn't live like that. A few weeks after his arrest, I packed what little I could fit into a suitcase and left. I quit my job, said hurried goodbyes to my friends, and boarded a train to somewhere quieter. A small town, far from the bustle of Tokyo, seemed like the perfect solution. I told myself I'd rebuild, find peace, and leave this nightmare behind. At first, the town felt like a sanctuary. The streets were quiet, the air smelled of rain and earth, and the people didn't ask questions. I found a modest job and started a new routine, one built around forgetting. But no matter how far I tried to run, the fear followed. At night, as the wind rattled my windows, I'd catch myself glancing at the shadows outside, half expecting to see him standing there, watching. The boxes stopped, but the memories didn't. They came uninvited, in moments of silence or the creak of an unfamiliar floorboard. I'd sit up in bed, heart pounding, certain I'd heard his footsteps on the stairs. I tried to tell myself it was impossible. He was behind bars. But the fear didn't care about logic. It clung to me, invisible but heavy, a constant reminder of what I'd lost, the ability to feel safe. I still don't understand why he chose me. How did he know my habits, my schedule, my life? I've stopped trying to answer those questions. Some things are better left unexplained. But I can't help wondering if he's still out there, waiting. Maybe in another city, maybe not. Or maybe he's behind bars, content in the knowledge that he's changed me forever. In this new town, people don't know my story. They don't see the way my eyes flick to the door when someone knocks, or how I avoid certain streets just in case. To them, I'm just another newcomer, looking for a fresh start. But every so often, when a package arrives unexpectedly, or the night grows too quiet, I feel that familiar knot in my stomach tighten. I remind myself that doors, once opened, can't always be closed. And some shadows, no matter how far you run, will always find a way to follow. Kyoto always felt safe to me. My neighborhood, with its narrow streets and old wooden houses, carried a quiet calm, the kind that settles into your bones. At 11, my world was small. School, friends, and the little secrets every kid collects. One of those secrets began on an autumn afternoon near the small stone shrine 10 minutes from home. It wasn't an extraordinary day, and I wasn't looking for trouble. But that's the thing about trouble. It finds you. I spotted the bicycle first, leaning against the bamboo wall of the shrine, its red frame almost glowing in the soft amber light. It wasn't rusted or forgotten. It looked freshly polished, waiting for someone. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, and I had the strangest sensation, like the bike was daring me to take it. I did. The first few days felt like a dream. I rode the bike everywhere, through narrow alleys, across the park, even to school. It felt like it was mine, like I'd always had it. My mom didn't ask many questions. She assumed someone had abandoned it. But soon, little things started to shift. The air seemed colder when I was near the bike. Shadows felt longer. And then I noticed him. The man didn't belong. He wore an old hat and walked with an almost deliberate slowness, like he didn't care who noticed him. At first, he seemed like any other stranger, but I couldn't shake the way he looked at me. His gaze was heavy, pinning me in place. He passed our house once, then again. Then he started showing up everywhere I took the bike. He never spoke, but the air seemed to tighten around him, like he was pulling the oxygen from the street. I told myself it was nothing, but it wasn't. The first knock on the door came on a Wednesday. It was too forceful to be casual. When I opened it, he was there, filling the doorway like a shadow. His voice was calm, almost kind, but the words cut like glass. The red bicycle. It's mine. I froze. How could he know? Mom appeared, her face set in that stern way that only moms can manage. She told him we couldn't just hand over the bike without proof, but the man didn't argue. Instead, he leaned forward, his lips curling into a smile that didn't touch his eyes. You'll regret keeping what doesn't belong to you. The notes began the next day. Small, carefully folded papers appeared in our mailbox, each one written in unfamiliar kanji. They were short but chilling. Return it. You've been warned. One simply said, it watches you. My stomach churned every time I saw them, but I couldn't bring myself to tell my mom. It felt like admitting the bicycle was more than just a bike. By then, I wasn't riding it anymore. I couldn't. Every time I touched the handlebars, my chest tightened, like something unseen was pressing against me. The man's visits became bolder. One night, while my mom was out, I saw him standing outside the kitchen window. He wasn't moving, just staring, his hat casting a shadow over his face. He wore a long coat now, the fabric rippling slightly in the wind, and his presence felt wrong, like a tear in reality. I ran to the door, locked it, and tried the phone. No signal. Time dragged on, his silhouette unmoving until my mom's car finally pulled into the driveway. By the time she opened the door, he was gone. I wanted to believe it was over. That night, we sat down for dinner, the tension easing when the sound of breaking glass shattered everything. The living room window exploded inward, and before I could react, a hand, thick, pale, and trembling, reached through, groping for the lock. My mom screamed, grabbing a chair, but then the front door flew open with a crack that echoed through the house. He stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with something between desperation and rage. "Give it back!" he roared, his voice breaking. It wasn't anger, it was fear. And that's when I realized the truth. The bike wasn't his to begin with. It belonged to something far worse. The sirens broke through the man's shouts like a knife through taut air. For a moment, he froze. His face, twisted with rage, shifted into something colder. Fear, or perhaps defeat. Without another word, he turned and bolted for the door, but it was too late. The police were already there, their voices sharp and commanding as they surrounded him. He didn't resist when they cuffed him. Instead, he stood there, breathing heavily, his shoulders slumped like a puppet with its strings cut. The house felt eerily quiet after they led him away. The shattered window, the broken door, it all looked surreal, like the aftermath of a nightmare that had spilled into the waking world. My mom tried to reassure me, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands, but I couldn't shake the image of the man's face, his eyes hollow yet desperate, as if he'd lost something far more than a bicycle. It wasn't until later that the police filled in the gaps. The man was a wanted criminal, they said, with a string of thefts in Kyoto and a history of untreated mental illness. The bicycle, they explained, had been stolen years ago from a local shop owner who had received it as a gift from his late father. To the man, though, it wasn't just a bike. It was an obsession. The officer said he spoke about it as if it were alive, something he was destined to protect, even after losing it. They called it delusion. I wasn't so sure. The shop owner came by to reclaim the bike. He was polite, even grateful, but as he wheeled it away, I felt a strange pang of unease, like I'd handed off something I'd never truly understood. The red frame gleamed in the sunlight, and for a moment I thought I saw a smudge on the seat, dark, almost like a handprint. I blinked, and it was gone. Life returned to normal, or so it seemed. But the experience left something behind, like a splinter buried too deep to remove. At night, I'd wake up to the sound of creaking wood or the faint rustle of leaves and find myself staring at the window, expecting to see a shadow watching from the street. I stopped going near the shrine, and when I passed it on the way to school, I quickened my pace. The air around it seemed heavier, like the place itself remembered. The man's fate became another piece of the story I couldn't escape. The police said he'd been sent to a mental rehabilitation center. He hadn't hurt anyone, they assured us, but the way they spoke about him, clinical, detached, left me uneasy. He wasn't just a thief. He was part of something I couldn't quite name, something that felt bigger than him, or me, or even the bike. I've never touched something that didn't belong to me again. It's not fear, exactly, though that's part of it. It's the memory of how easily the ordinary can twist into something else. A bicycle, a shrine, a quiet street in Kyoto, they all seemed harmless. But now, they linger in the corners of my mind, threads in a web I'll never untangle. Sometimes, when I walk past the shrine, I feel the air shift, as if the past is still watching, waiting for me to make the same mistake. I wonder if the man feels it too, wherever he is. Maybe he was a victim, like me, drawn into something we both mistook for simple. Or maybe he was the catalyst, carrying his obsession from one person to the next until someone else picks up the red bicycle and the story begins again.